I came home from deployment to find my house already taken, already lived in, and already defended by paperwork HOA Karen swore gave her the right. While I was overseas wearing a uniform, she rented my home like surplus property and called it community protection. She decided my absence meant abandonment and treated my service like a vacancy notice. That decision detonated the second I stepped onto my street. I didn't need a letter or a warning to know something was wrong. The lawn was trimmed to regulation perfection, the hedges squared off, and the sidewalk looked like it had been scrubbed for a showing. That wouldn't matter unless you'd left for a combat zone with weeds up to your knees and a sprinkler that screamed every third cycle. Someone had curated my house. Someone had decided it no longer belonged to me, and whoever did it thought I would accept it quietly. Before we move forward, drop a comment. Where are you watching from? The welcome mat confirmed it, bright and new and completely wrong, sitting where ours used to be. Our mat had teeth and intention and warned people to come back with a warrant. And this one whispered slogans about laughter and love like the place was a rental brochure. I stopped walking because my body had already caught up to the truth my brain was still assembling. It wasn't panic, it was data. The same internal click that happens when something familiar has been altered without permission. It felt like noticing your toothbrush moved half an inch to the left, except this time it was the entire structure of your life. I scanned the driveway and saw the red Tesla parked with confidence, centered, relaxed, claiming space like it had earned it. That car didn't belong to a guest or a visitor or someone waiting to be told they were in the wrong place. It belonged to someone who had been told they were allowed to be there. The wind chimes hanging near the door sealed it, a sound my wife hated, a sound that didn't exist before I left. I moved forward anyway, measured, controlled, because years of training don't evaporate just because the battlefield changes. I reached for the doorbell and froze before pressing it because movement crossed the side window. Someone walked past barefoot, casual, carrying something cold and blended, not worried about who might be outside. Music followed, smooth and deliberate, the kind of jazz people put on when they want atmosphere without commitment. The door opened before I knocked, and a man in flip-flops and aviators stood there holding a smoothie like I was interrupting his morning routine. He looked at me the way people look at lost delivery drivers or surveyors who wandered too far. He asked if he could help me, and his tone said the house behind him was already accounted for. I didn't respond right away, not because I was confused, but because I was calculating distance, posture, intent, and outcome. I told him it was my house, slow and clear, the way you speak when you expect resistance. He tilted his head and told me he didn't think so, like this was a misunderstanding that favored him. I pulled out my key, the same key that had survived airports, checkpoints, and one blast that rattled my teeth, and I slid it into the lock. It didn't turn. That single mechanical refusal said more than any argument could. He stepped back and suggested I call the HOA, explaining they'd signed everything through them, explaining it like this was normal and settled. He introduced himself as Zach, like a name could soften trespass. I almost laughed, because that was the moment the situation crossed from violation into insult. A black SUV rolled up behind me without lights or sirens, just decals and intent, announcing itself as Community Safety Enforcement. Two men stepped out wearing uniforms designed to borrow authority without earning it, khakis pressed, vests clean, eyes empty. One of them told me to step away from the residence, voice rehearsed, confident in a script written by someone else. I told him it was my house again, louder this time, not for him but for myself. He didn't react, just repeated that the tenants had paperwork, and that the property was under HOA-managed leasehold. He said trespassing like it was a legal conclusion instead of a lie. I asked where Karen was, because by then I knew exactly who had orchestrated this. The guards exchanged a look, and right on cue, she appeared from the side like she'd been waiting for her entrance. HOA Karen wore a visor and sunglasses and carried a clipboard like a weapon she knew how to use. She smiled before she spoke, a smile practiced enough to survive mirrors and meetings. She told me I was early and mentioned I wasn't scheduled back yet, as if my return from deployment was a calendar inconvenience she could manage. She spoke about my service the way people speak about weather, polite and irrelevant. I told her I wasn't scheduled, I was deployed, and the word landed between us with weight. She She thanked me for my service anyway, and cited a bylaw like gratitude could be stapled to theft. She explained that homes left unoccupied for a certain period could be reassigned, her voice smooth, her eyes already finished with me. She gestured toward Zach inside my doorway and called it a temporary placement, as if that changed the fact that my life was being worn by strangers. I asked her if she rented out my house, and she said she protected the community and insisted it wasn't personal. I asked about the deployment waiver my wife had filed, and her smile twitched just long enough to register. She called it a clerical error and told me I could contest the board's actions at the next monthly meeting, like this was a parking dispute. I summarized what she'd done in one sentence, and she shrugged like the damage was already complete. She said they followed procedure, and I told her procedure wasn't the law. She glanced at her guards and asked them to escort me off the property, her voice calm, her hands steady. They stepped closer, not aggressive, just enough pressure to test whether I'd react. Through the open door, I saw my wife's framed photo still hanging on the wall, untouched, like a trophy they forgot to remove. Zach lifted his smoothie and waved at me from behind the threshold. The key in my palm dug into my skin as my hand clenched, and for a split second I felt the old instinct surface, sharp and final. I didn't act on it. I dropped the key back into my pocket, turned away, walked to the curb, and sat in my rental car with my eyes forward. I wasn't defeated. I was assessing. I didn't call a lawyer, not yet, because lawyers fix things after the damage is done. I scrolled until I found a number I hadn't used since the last time someone tried to make me feel powerless. I sent one word and waited. The reply came back almost immediately. A single confirmation that told me I wasn't alone. I wasn't asking for help. I was calling in people who understood what it meant to reclaim ground without losing yourself. I didn't come home early, and I didn't come home unannounced, no matter how much HOA Karen wanted to rewrite that truth. My deployment orders were filed, documented, and acknowledged long before my boots ever left the ground. There were forms, waivers, emails, confirmations, and follow-ups that my wife handled with the kind of precision people develop when they know systems are built to fail them. We had never missed an HOA fee, never ignored a notice, never given them a reason to single us out beyond the fact that we weren't physically present to push back. Absence, to someone like HOA Karen, wasn't a circumstance, it was an opening. She didn't see deployment as duty, she saw it as leverage, a window where authority could be exercised without resistance, and consequences could be delayed long enough to feel imaginary. Before I left, my relationship with the HOA had been clean and boring, exactly the way it should be. I cut my grass, fixed my sprinkler, attended meetings when they mattered, and ignored them when they didn't. I knew the bylaws well enough to know when someone was bluffing, and I knew Karen well enough to know she hated that. She thrived on people who nodded, complied, and apologized, and I had never been one of them. That history mattered more than she'd ever admit, because when she stood there with her clipboard explaining reassignment like it was neutral policy, I could hear the satisfaction under her professionalism. This wasn't just enforcement, it was a settling of a score she'd been waiting to cash. My authority in that moment didn't come from anger or volume. It came from the fact that I knew exactly what I'd signed, what I hadn't, and what she was inventing on the fly. When she spoke about procedure, she leaned on language designed to sound final without being lawful, phrases that depended on people backing down rather than pushing back. She talked about unoccupied property as if deployment stripped a house of its owner the way time strips paint. She framed reassignment as temporary stewardship, a harmless intervention, when in reality it was seizure with better branding. And the most telling part was how quickly she moved past my objections, how fast she redirected me toward a future board meeting instead of addressing the crime standing in front of us. That redirection wasn't accidental. It was the core of her strategy. Delay creates fatigue, and fatigue creates surrender. She expected me to go home angry, cool off, get busy with life, and let the system bury me under timelines and technicalities. She didn't expect me to stand there and listen. Not really. Not with the same focus I used to listen for changes in wind or tone when something dangerous was about to happen. Every word she chose was meant to slow me down, to push resolution far enough away that it would lose urgency. But urgency was all I had left in that moment, because my family was already displaced, and my house was already occupied. When the guards closed in, I understood exactly what kind of authority Karen believed in. It wasn't legal authority rooted in statutes or enforcement powers. It was performative authority, borrowed uniforms and rehearsed lines meant to overwhelm civilians who didn't know where the line actually was. She relied on the assumption that people don't challenge men in vests or women with clipboards, that they fold under confident delivery. I had spent too long in environments where confident delivery got people killed to confuse tone with truth. Watching her deploy that tactic on my own driveway didn't make me reckless, it made me patient. The real cost of her actions didn't register until later, after I left the curb and drove away, because authority abuse always looks cleanest at the point of impact. It's only when you step back that you see the collateral damage. My wife tried to hold it together in the car, her hands tight around the steering wheel, her voice calm in a way that took effort. My kids were quiet, confused, processing a reality they hadn't been prepared for, because no one prepares you for the idea that your home can be taken by a committee while your parent is serving overseas. Authority, when it's abused, doesn't just take property, it fractures trust, and I could see that fracture forming in real time. That night, in a motel that smelled like stale carpet and compromise, I sat at a table that wobbled and thought about the version of authority I believed in. The kind that comes with responsibility, accountability, and consequence, not immunity. Karen's authority existed because no one had forced it to justify itself yet. It relied on the idea that paperwork could outpace truth, and that people without time would eventually give up. She didn't know me well enough to understand that time pressure works differently on someone who's spent years waiting, watching, and planning under worse conditions. I didn't sleep much, not because I was angry, but because my mind was already shifting from reaction to structure. Authority can be challenged emotionally, but it's dismantled methodically. If Karen had built her case on bylaws and procedure, then that was where she'd be exposed. I wasn't interested in yelling or confrontation for its own sake, because noise gives people like her cover. What I wanted was alignment. Facts lined up so tightly that her story would collapse under its own weight. That meant understanding every angle she thought she'd secured while I was gone. By morning, the outline of what came next was already forming, not as revenge, but as correction. Karen believed she had acted within a vacuum, that my absence meant isolation. She didn't realize that the authority she'd abused had a paper trail, witnesses, and a timeline that didn't care how confident she sounded on a sidewalk. She thought she'd exploited a gap in presence, but what she'd actually done was create a record, one that would follow her long after the visor and clipboard stopped working. Once the shock wore off and the anger settled into something colder, I started seeing HOA Karen not as a singular problem, but as the visible edge of a system designed to protect people like her. She didn't act alone, and she didn't need to. The HOA functioned like a closed circuit where authority circulated internally, reinforced by titles, procedures, and the assumption that no one outside the loop would ever challenge it. Karen was the face, the voice, the one who stood on sidewalks and smiled through violations. But behind her were boards, votes, committees, and quiet agreements that turned personal bias into enforceable action. Understanding that structure mattered, because you can't dismantle abuse if you only confront the mouthpiece. The first thing I noticed when I started digging was how intentionally opaque everything was. Meetings were technically open, but schedules changed, minutes were vague, and decisions were summarized instead of documented. Language did the heavy lifting. Phrases like emergency quorum and provisional control used to justify actions that would never survive scrutiny in daylight. Karen hid behind those words because she knew most people wouldn't look past them. She relied on residents trusting that someone else had already verified the legality, that responsibility diffused upward until it disappeared entirely. That diffusion was her shield, and it let her act with confidence even when she was wrong. Private enforcement was another layer of insulation. The guards who told me I was trespassing weren't law enforcement, but they were dressed close enough to trigger compliance. Their authority existed in the gap between perception and reality, and Karen exploited that gap expertly. She never told them to break the law. She told them to enforce HOA policy, knowing most people wouldn't know where one ended and the other began. That ambiguity gave her plausible deniability while still achieving the outcome she wanted, which was control. Watching those men repeat her lines without question told me everything I needed to know about how power flowed in that organization. As I reviewed documents, I started to see patterns that went beyond my own case. Enforcement wasn't evenly applied, and violations clustered around certain houses, certain families, certain absences. Homes with owners who traveled, worked long hours, or didn't attend meetings were flagged more often. Warnings escalated faster. Fines accumulated quietly until they could be framed as chronic non-compliance. Karen's handwriting showed up again and again on the most aggressive actions, her notes reducing people to problems that needed solving. It wasn't random, and it wasn't about standards. It was about opportunity. The bylaws themselves had been weaponized through revision and reinterpretation. Sections that once addressed neglected sheds or long-abandoned properties were stretched to include homes that were occupied in every way that mattered, except physically. Deployment, medical recovery, even extended caregiving were reframed as absence rather than responsibility. Karen didn't invent those interpretations on the spot. She nurtured them over time, shaping board discussions until the language bent just enough to justify what she wanted to do. By the time my house was reassigned, the groundwork had already been laid, and all she had to do was push it through. What made it worse was how she personalized enforcement while pretending it was impersonal. In public, she spoke about community health and visual standards, but in private notes, she referred to properties as issues and owners as obstacles. That distinction mattered because it showed intent. She wasn't reacting to violations. She was selecting targets. When I found the meeting minutes that referenced my street by name, framed as a recurring concern, it clicked. This wasn't about my lawn or my absence. It was about my refusal to be managed when I was present. Deployment just gave her the cover she needed. The deeper I went, the clearer it became that the HOA operated less like a neighborhood association and more like a small government with none of the oversight. Votes were recorded without context, dissent was minimized, and accountability stopped at the boardroom door. Karen thrived in that environment because she understood how to move within it without leaving fingerprints. She let the structure absorb blame while she exercised discretion. That's why confronting her directly on my driveway hadn't worked, because the system she represented was designed to outlast individual objections. I also started hearing stories once people realized I was looking. Neighbors who'd been fined into silence, renters who'd been shuffled without explanation, families who'd moved rather than fight. They all described the same pattern: polite escalation followed by sudden pressure, always justified by rules no one had time to read. Karen's name came up often, not always attached to anger, but always to resignation. People spoke about her the way you speak about weather you can't change, something to endure rather than challenge. That resignation was her real power, and breaking it required exposing how deliberately it had been cultivated. By the time I finished mapping out the HOA's internal structure, I understood that my house was just one piece in a larger apparatus of control. Karen wasn't reckless. She was systematic. She knew exactly how far she could push before someone pushed back, and she stayed just inside that line. My deployment didn't create her behavior, it revealed it. And once it was revealed, the structure that protected her became the same structure that would eventually collapse, acknowledging what it had enabled. Once I understood the structure I was dealing with, emotion stopped being useful, and evidence became everything. Anger burns fast and loud, but proof moves slowly and permanently. And I needed something that would outlast Karen's confidence and the HOA's denials. I approached it the same way I approached any operation where the other side believed they were untouchable, by assuming they were sloppy somewhere and patient enough to let me find it. Karen had built her authority on the idea that no one would ever trace her steps backward, that residents would argue outcomes instead of examining origins. I wasn't interested in outcomes anymore. I wanted the spine of the thing. The first layer was paperwork, because people who abuse systems always trust paper too much. I pulled every version of the HOA bylaws I could find, archived copies, emailed drafts, scanned attachments from old newsletters, anything that showed evolution instead of presentation. Side by side, the changes were subtle enough to pass unnoticed, but deliberate enough to tell a story. Clauses had been expanded, definitions loosened, timelines shortened. Words like abandonment and non-contributive had been reinterpreted just enough to include people who were absent for reasons that couldn't be challenged publicly without looking cruel. Karen didn't rewrite the rules in one swing. She sanded them down over time until they fit her hand. Digital records filled in what paper tried to hide. Metadata doesn't care about intent or explanation. It only records when and where something was touched. I traced file histories, edit timestamps, user logins, and approval chains. Emergency revisions appeared after my deployment date, backfilled to look legitimate. Votes were recorded during windows where quorum technically existed, but participation was limited to the same small circle. Karen's login showed up more than anyone else's, not as the final approver, but as the initiator, the one who nudged drafts forward before discussion ever happened. That distinction mattered, because it showed premeditation rather than reaction. Then there were the meeting minutes, sanitized summaries that hid more than they revealed. I requested full recordings under disclosure rules the HOA rarely expected anyone to invoke. What I heard in those audio files didn't match the tone of the written summaries at all. Karen spoke freely when she thought only the board was listening. She talked about problem properties, about setting examples, about using absence to reset the neighborhood. She joked about people who couldn't show up to defend themselves, laughed about how quickly resistance faded once pressure was applied. Those recordings didn't just show abuse, they showed comfort with abuse, and comfort is what prosecutors look for. Proof also came from people Karen never considered threats. Tenants who'd been placed into homes without context started reaching out once they realized what had happened. They weren't villains. They were participants in a story they'd been fed, told the properties were foreclosed, abandoned, or reassigned legally. Emails they forwarded showed Karen's signature authorizing rentals, outlining terms, and instructing them to direct all questions to the HOA, not the owner. The language was polished, professional, and false. When those documents sat next to my deployment orders and mortgage statements, the contradiction wasn't subtle, it was damning. Neighbors filled in the human gaps. One remembered asking Karen about my absence and being told it didn't matter anymore. Another recalled seeing contractors change locks while I was overseas, work orders approved without notice. A widow from the corner lot remembered making a comment about how strange it felt, only to be brushed off and warned not to interfere with board matters. These weren't angry people looking for drama. They were cautious witnesses who'd been waiting for permission to speak. Once they did, the pattern stopped being deniable. Financial records were the final confirmation. HOA accounts showed rental income routed through intermediary entities, fees labeled as community recovery or maintenance allocation. Money moved in ways that made sense on a spreadsheet, but not in reality. Properties didn't just get reassigned, they generated profit, and that profit didn't flow back to the community. It pooled quietly, masked by administrative language, and reinforced Karen's ability to keep acting without scrutiny. Abuse always leaves a financial footprint, because control without reward doesn't sustain itself. As the file grew, so did the clarity. This wasn't a misunderstanding or an overreach corrected by apology. It was a system designed to convert absence into opportunity, legality into leverage, and silence into consent. My house was the entry point, not the exception. Every document, every recording, every witness statement tightened the narrative until Karen's version couldn't breathe. She had relied on the assumption that no one would ever assemble the whole picture. She was wrong. By the time I finished compiling the evidence, the story told itself without emotion or commentary. Dates lined up, signatures matched, Voices confirmed intent. The proof didn't shout, it waited, confident that once it was placed in the right hands, it wouldn't need embellishment. That was the moment I stopped wondering if we would win, and started deciding how publicly the collapse would happen. The confrontation didn't arrive with shouting or slammed doors. It arrived with visibility, and that was what Karen feared most. Systems like hers survive in quiet rooms and private emails, not under eyes that don't look away. Once the evidence existed, the next step wasn't to threaten her with it, but to let her feel its weight pressing in from every side. I didn't rush her, because people who rely on authority always defeat themselves when they believe they still control the tempo. Karen believed that. She thought she could escalate faster than anyone could expose her, and she miscalculated how dangerous patience can be. I returned to the HOA office during business hours, not to argue but to observe. Camera visible, posture neutral, voice calm. Karen noticed immediately, her smile tightening in a way I recognized as reflexive rather than confident. She spoke louder than necessary, asking what I wanted, framing my presence as disruptive before I'd said a word. I didn't respond to her performance. I walked past her to the bulletin board and photographed the posted bylaws, the one she claimed justified everything. The date stamp was visible. So was the signature. She tried to position herself between me and the board, but the camera caught the movement, and she stepped back as soon as she realized it would look defensive. The collapse accelerated once witnesses entered the frame. A neighbor who'd never spoken at meetings asked Karen directly whether my deployment notice had been received. Karen answered too quickly, said yes without thinking, then froze when the neighbor followed up by asking why she'd said otherwise weeks earlier. That pause was brief, almost imperceptible, but it was enough. Silence spread through the room, the kind that isn't empty but charged, because people were processing the possibility that the person who'd spoken with authority for years might have been lying the entire time. Karen didn't recover from that moment. She changed subjects, redirected, tried to assert order, but the illusion had cracked. Public pressure changed her behavior immediately. She began filing complaints instead of responding to questions, calling law enforcement to establish intimidation instead of authority. She wanted uniforms back in the story, wanted the focus off documents and onto demeanor. Patrol cars arrived more than once, always for vague reports of harassment or trespass. Each time I handed over the same packet, calm and complete. Each time officers hesitated longer before siding with her. The more she escalated, the more she exposed how little she actually controlled. The real collapse happened when she crossed a line she couldn't explain away. She entered my house without authorization, claiming concern for tenants, searching for evidence she believed I was hiding inside walls she no longer had the right to touch. She was caught on camera moving through rooms she had no legal claim to, opening drawers, rifling through keepsakes, treating my home like a storage unit she'd misplaced something in. When police arrived mid-search, she didn't have a script prepared. She tried to justify it with her title, with urgency, with authority that suddenly meant nothing. Titles don't override locks, and authority doesn't excuse breaking and entering. Her arrest wasn't dramatic. It was procedural, which made it worse for her. No shouting, no struggle, just cuffs and documentation. Neighbors watched from porches and windows, phones raised, recording a woman who had spent years recording them. Karen screamed about misunderstandings, about responsibility, about persecution, but none of it landed. The officers didn't argue. They didn't console her. They didn't negotiate. They followed process, the same thing she'd insisted protected her actions. That symmetry wasn't lost on anyone watching. Even after that, she tried to control the narrative. From custody, she filed complaints, restraining orders, and appeals designed to drain time and attention. She believed volume could substitute for truth, that flooding the system would exhaust anyone challenging her. Instead, it documented her desperation. Each filing contradicted the last. Timelines overlapped. Accusations grew more exaggerated. What had once looked like authority now looked like flailing. Public sympathy didn't shift toward her. It evaporated. People don't support power when it stops pretending to be rational. The moment it fully collapsed wasn't when she was taken away. It was when no one defended her afterward. Board members went silent, emails stopped, and the HOA office closed without announcement. Karen's name became something people avoided saying out loud, not out of fear, but out of embarrassment for having trusted her. Authority, once exposed as abuse, doesn't linger. It dissolves quickly, leaving only questions about how long it was allowed to operate unchecked. Watching that collapse didn't feel like victory. It felt like inevitability finally catching up. Karen had built her power on control, and control can't survive daylight. Once the story belonged to everyone instead of her, there was nothing left for her to manage. The confrontation ended not with a speech or a verdict, but with absence, and that absence was louder than any argument she'd ever made. Karen didn't stop when the cameras went away, and I never expected her to. People who build their identity around control don't surrender it just because the public turns against them. They retreat, regroup, and strike from places that feel safer, quieter, more procedural. Her retaliation didn't come with shouting or spectacle. It came folded inside envelopes, logged into systems, and routed through channels designed to look legitimate. That shift told me everything I needed to know. She was done trying to dominate the street and ready to fight in paperwork, where she believed exhaustion would do what intimidation no longer could. The first move landed like a delayed charge. A city complaint filed in my name against my own property, listing violations that didn't exist and activities that never happened. Unauthorized training, community safety risk, language chosen carefully to trigger inspections, reviews, and the kind of scrutiny that could stall everything indefinitely. The timing wasn't accidental. It was filed after her arrest, but processed as if it predated the fallout. A final attempt to poison the well before anyone looked too closely at where it came from. She wanted my house condemned on paper, even if she couldn't touch it physically anymore. Fear showed up differently then. Not sharp, not explosive, but heavy. This wasn't about winning an argument or exposing corruption anymore. This was about whether my family could stay in our home, whether my service record could be twisted into a liability, whether the system she'd abused could still be bent far enough to finish the job. Karen was in custody, but the mechanisms she'd learned to manipulate were still moving, still capable of doing damage if left unchecked. That's when reaction gave way entirely to expertise. I stopped handling things alone and started aligning with people who understood the system better than she ever had. Every accusation was answered with documentation. Every claim was met with timestamps, permits, waivers, and footage. Training activities were contextualized, approved programs referenced, neighbors' statements collected and notarized. Where Karen relied on implication, I relied on specificity. Where she blurred definitions, I tightened them. The difference mattered, because systems respond differently to confidence than they do to clarity. Clarity leaves less room to maneuver. We traced the complaint itself next, not just what it said, but how it entered the system. Submission logs showed it bypassed public portals and moved through a restricted channel reserved for verified legal firms. That detail cracked the facade. Karen hadn't filed it herself. She'd used someone else's credentials, someone who believed they were insulated by distance and paperwork. The firm's address led to a strip mall office tied to family connections that had already surfaced in the financial records. The retaliation wasn't spontaneous. It was coordinated, a fallback plan triggered when public authority failed. Once that connection was established, the tone of the response changed. City inspectors stopped treating the complaint as routine and started treating it as evidence. The inspection itself was thorough but professional. Every step documented, every question answered without defensiveness. There was no chaos to feed on, no disorder to exaggerate. When the ruling came back, it was clean and final. Complaint dismissed. Submission flagged as retaliatory. Further inquiry opened into misuse of legal access. Karen's last lever didn't just fail, it snapped. What broke her wasn't exposure or arrest. It was the slow realization that she no longer controlled any of the tools she'd depended on. Funding dried up when HOA accounts were frozen, pending audit. Legal representation withdrew when invoices stopped being paid. Board members distanced themselves, publicly, then privately, then entirely. The isolation she'd once weaponized against others settled around her instead. Power doesn't vanish dramatically most of the time. It erodes, piece by piece, until the person holding it realizes they're gripping air. By the end, retaliation wasn't something I reacted to anymore. It was something I anticipated. Each move Karen made created another record, another trail, another confirmation of intent. She couldn't help herself. The habits that built her authority were the same ones that documented her downfall. Watching that unfold wasn't satisfying in a cinematic way. It was procedural, methodical, and inevitable. And when the system finally finished turning on her, it didn't do it loudly. It did it the way systems always do when faced with proof they can't ignore, by quietly removing her from relevance altogether. The end didn't arrive with relief, and it didn't arrive with celebration, because real endings rarely announce themselves. It arrived in the form of absence, of things no longer happening. No more letters slipped into the mailbox with legal phrasing designed to raise blood pressure. No more patrol cars slowing near the curb like they were deciding whether to stop. No more emails from HOA addresses pretending to be neutral while carrying threats underneath. The noise that had surrounded my life for months simply stopped, and that silence was heavier than any verdict could have been. Karen's case moved through the system without my involvement, and that was deliberate. I didn't attend hearings, didn't sit in courtrooms, didn't watch her try to argue her way out of consequences she'd authored herself. I didn't need to. The evidence didn't require a narrator anymore. It spoke in documents, in timestamps, in recordings she forgot existed. Guilty findings came down without drama, followed by restitution orders and disqualifications that stripped her of any authority she once claimed. The HOA dissolved quietly after that, its assets redistributed, its board erased from relevance like it had never existed at all. The neighborhood adjusted without ceremony. People repainted signs, replaced locks, and started making decisions without asking permission. The HOA office stayed dark, blinds drawn, the sign removed one morning without explanation. No announcement followed, no apology, no acknowledgement of what had been done. That felt appropriate. Systems that thrive on control don't deserve closure speeches. They deserve erasure. Karen's name faded from conversation, not because people forgot, but because there was no reason to remember someone who no longer mattered. Inside the house, normal returned slowly. Not perfectly, not all at once, but in increments that felt earned. Furniture moved back where it belonged. Walls were repainted. My son put his things back without asking whether they would stay. Trust rebuilt itself quietly, the way it always does, through consistency rather than reassurance. There were no drills, no files open on the table, no late nights tracking movements, just routines, unremarkable and therefore priceless. I stood on the porch one evening and noticed the grass had grown uneven again. I didn't rush to fix it. No one cited it. No one documented it. No one cared. That was the point. Authority had returned to where it was supposed to be, invisible unless needed, absent unless invited. Karen had spent years inserting herself into spaces she didn't belong, and now she wasn't present anywhere at all. Not in meetings, not in inboxes, not in the decisions that shaped people's lives. The final confirmation came not through paperwork, but through indifference. When her appeal was denied, it didn't register as news. When her remaining filings were dismissed, they didn't ripple outward. The system moved on without her, and that was the most complete defeat she could have suffered. People like Karen don't fear punishment as much as they fear irrelevance, and irrelevance is exactly what she became. I didn't frame the outcome as a victory, because victories imply contests, and this was a correction. Something broken had been set right, and once it was right, it didn't need attention anymore. I stopped scanning the street. I stopped listening for changes. I stopped preparing for the next move because there was no one left to make one. The house was mine again in the only way that matters, unquestioned and uncontested. HOA Karen went silent.